Última hora. El honorable senador republicano Josh Hawley ha revelado la grave situación de dictadura que está por venir por Nancy Pelosi. La dictadura que Nancy Pelosi quiere implementar ya está haciéndose conocer. Con la implementación de uniformados que rodean todo el Capitolio para que nadie pueda oponerse a las medidas que el ilegítimo desee implementar. Nunca el titán rodeó el Capitolio con uniformados. Porque la gente confía en sus sabias decisiones que llevaron a un gran crecimiento económico. En estos momentos sigue aumentando la tasa de desempleo y lo único que hacen los demócratas es hablar mal del titán y los senadores que apoyan al titán. Como le acaba de pasar al honorable senador Ted Cruz, el cual ha sido criticado por los medios de televisión que están a favor del ilegítimo. Por querer cuidar a su familia como un buen padre. Aunque admitió que no ha sido una sabia decisión. Se ha devuelto lo más pronto posible a Texas. Para enfrentar la situación climática que está padeciendo varios estados. Ted solo ha estado un día en Cancún y se regresó lo más pronto posible a Texas. Y por esta decisión que él tomó los medios solo han estado hablando de él. Y no cuentan que el ilegítimo acaba de firmar medidas que están aumentando el gasto público en casi el triple a comparación de la administración del titán. Esta medida es tan alarmante debido a que los países con más gasto público terminan en crisis como la situación de Venezuela. Nadie habla de los negocios que la familia del ilegítimo tiene con China. Y solo porque el honorable Ted Cruz está un día en Cancún por petición de su familia. Le es desacreditado su ardua gestión para acabar con la crisis. Todo lo que dijo Josh Hawley concuerda con los planes de Pelosi para implementar una dictadura. Buscan desprestigiar personas que sí trabajan por su país como Ted Cruz. Y no por el de otros como el ilegítimo con China. A continuación el comunicado del honorable Josh Hawley. Y después el comunicado del honorable Ted Cruz.
Senator, I appreciate your coming on tonight. This makes me genuinely nervous that someone like this could have any control over the so-called security at the U.S. Capitol or in Washington or in America.
Yeah, it's very disturbing, Tucker. I mean, some of the statements that the general has made are just downright crazy. You cited some of them. I mean, saying that Elise Stefanik, for instance, ought to be treated like a terrorist and not allowed to fly, put on the no-fly list. Also, his statements about law enforcement. This is somebody who this whole last year, Tucker, encouraged, condoned the violent rioting in our city, said that federal law enforcement who were sent to Portland to protect the federal courthouse, he said that they were a mob themselves, said that they were acting like they were serving a dictator, attacked them for not being real soldiers. Those are his words. I mean, it's unbelievable. It's just unbelievable. And it shows that Nancy Pelosi isn't interested in getting any facts. She's interested in power and in amassing power and an excuse to keep hold of power, including those thousands of troops who are still at the Capitol, who are still there treating it like an armed camp. Why? No one will say, but this is what Pelosi's interested in.
So I saw an internal memo today from House Republicans saying, you know, we're not going to question the presence of all those federal troops in Washington, because there is some kind of threat, which they never explained. What a betrayal of the country, I would say. But beyond that, this is a guy running around calling himself general. I mean, shouldn't we be getting a little concerned at this point that the leadership of the U.S. military should be totally nonpartisan and not involved in these debates? I mean, are we sure that it still is?
Yeah, well, this is somebody, this particular general, who's been retired now for a while, and I don't question his service to our country at all, Tucker. I applaud him for it, but he has been a partisan, a dedicated partisan, that's putting it mildly, since he left the military, an extreme left-wing Democrat, and you can just see it in the comments that he's made. But I'm concerned about what they're laying the groundwork for here, what Nancy Pelosi's doing. I'm concerned that they continue to treat the January 6th catastrophe, that criminal riot, as an excuse to seize power, to control more power, to step on people's Second Amendment rights, to take away their First Amendment rights. Now we're hearing about a domestic war on terror. I mean, what's that going to be? An excuse to go rifle through the emails and bank statements and personal messages of law-abiding Americans? I mean, this is very, very frightening stuff. And what Pelosi and the Democrats are doing here, trying to consolidate power, it's dangerous.
Please convince your fellow Republicans on the Hill to stand up for the country. Please. I think what you said is absolutely right. It needed to be said, and I hope others will say it. Thank you very much. Senator, good to see you.
Thank you.
Ahora. El comunicado del honorable Ted Cruz.
Home here in Texas. This has been a really hard week for the state of Texas. We've had not one but two horrific storms. Over 4 million Texans lost their power, lost heat, lost electricity, lost lights. This has been a frustrating week for Texans across our state. For a state as incredible as ours, the greatest state in the greatest country in the world, the idea that we couldn't heat our homes or turn on the lights was ridiculous. It was frustrating, and it shouldn't have happened. The last 24 hours, it has become a news story and a bit of a Twitter sensation that I went with my family, traveled yesterday to Mexico. I just got back. I flew out late last night. We had spent 2 days without power, and my girls wanted to take a trip with their friends and frankly get somewhere where it was warmer. And Heidi and I agreed. We took them. I flew them down last night, and then I just flew back today. Before then, and going forward, I am continuing to work with state officials, with local officials, to get the grid back on, to get power back to Texas homes. At the height, we had over 4 million Americans, over 4 million Texans without power. The governor's now reported those numbers are down to about 325,000. I'm grateful for all of the people that have gotten power, but that's still 325,000 too many people not to have power. That needs to be fixed, and after that, there needs to be a serious examination as to why it was the grid was not able to handle the impact of this storm, and that's something that I'm going to press for. I know the governor's called for, and I expect leaders across the state of Texas will call for.
First question. Yeah, obviously there's a lot of upset folks. You said you always plan to come back the next day. Was that the case, or did you change your plan?
No, I didn't say that. We left yesterday. The plan had been to stay through the weekend with the family. That was the plan, and you know, I have to admit, it was, the last week's been tough on a lot of folks. When our power went out, we were initially, we had power longer than many. And in fact, a lot of our girls' friends came over. We were hosting them for dinner, and they were at our house because we had power and no one else did. And then the power went out right as we were starting to sit down for dinner, and was out for 2 days. The first night we had a bit of a, what I would say a sleepover, where we had kids huddled in sleeping bags and blankets and wrapped up, and no lights and no heat, so everyone had flashlights. We had candles going. That's an experience Texans all across our state had. We were, by the second day, we were clustered around the fireplace as the only source of heat, and so huddled up in jackets and by the fireplace, and our girls, when they got the news that school was canceled this week, they said, "Look, why don't we take a trip? Let's go somewhere where it's not so cold." And Heidi and I, this had been a tough week, and this has been a tough year for kids all across the state of Texas, and so we were trying to be good parents and said, "Okay, we'll do it." And so we booked the flight. You know, I have to admit, I started having second thoughts almost the moment I sat down on the plane, because on the one hand, all of us who are parents have a responsibility to take care of our kids, take care of our family. That's something Texans have been doing across the state. But I also have a responsibility that I take very seriously of fighting for the state of Texas and frankly, leaving when so many Texans were hurting. Didn't feel right, and so I changed my return flight and flew back on the first available flight I could take. I couldn't take a morning flight because the current restrictions require a COVID test, so I had to get a COVID test this morning before I could get on a flight back, so I took the first flight I could get after getting the COVID test and testing negative.
Do you understand why people are so upset right now? And it sounds like you do have a little bit of remorse from this. Do you feel that it's deserved or not?
Oh, sure. Of course I understand why people are upset. listen, we're in a strange time where Twitter's been going crazy and the media's going crazy, and there's a lot of venom and vitriol that I think is unfortunate, frankly, on both sides. I think everyone ought to treat each other with respect and decency and try to understand each other more, particularly in a time of crisis. You know, I will say one of the great things about Texas, I've served in the Senate 8 years. We've seen crisis after crisis after crisis in this state. And over again, whenever there is a disaster, whenever there's a crisis, Texans come together. Texans come together and unite, and that's one of the things that always makes me proud of this state. When I arrived and saw the initial firestorm, what had started with second thoughts that I had as soon as we left, grew even greater. And I certainly regret that this has become a distraction at a time when so many Texans are hurting and frustrated and mad, that this has become an item of debate and distraction. I think that's unfortunate. That was certainly not my intention. My intention was to take care of my family, which was the intention of Texans, every Texan across the country and across the state who lost heat, lost light. You were doing the same thing. You were taking care of your family, and I think it's unfortunate that was understood in the way that some of the critics are taking it.
Who's the blame? Who's the blame for this disaster in Texas? Who's the blame?
Well, look, we had two storms that combined, one that hit early in the week and a second that hit midweek, and it was, that combination is extremely unusual. I spoke this weekend before the storms hit to a meteorologist, a weather expert, who was looking at the projections and telling me this looks dangerous. This combination of not just one but two, the impact on the state is going to be very serious. That the impact is going to knock down power production. It's going to impact the state profoundly. And so I've started, before the storms hit and as they were hitting, trying to warn Texans, take this seriously. This is not just another winter storm. The impact of this is going to be significant. And based on the expert guidance I was getting, I wanted to make sure Texans knew that. I also connected that expert with the governor to make sure the governor had the benefit of this meteorologist's judgment about the storm and the magnitude of what was coming in. And the governor had just declared a disaster in all 254 counties in Texas. That was before the storms had hit, because the governor was receiving the same advice I was, that this combination of two storms was exceptionally dangerous. When the governor declared a disaster, I joined with John Cornyn. The two of us wrote a letter to President Biden urging the president to declare a federal disaster area for the state of Texas, to grant the governor's request, and President Biden did so. I'm grateful that he did. What was not anticipated is that with this historic cold, and we knew we were going to see temperatures 30, 40 degrees below historic norms for this time of year, what was not anticipated is that the electrical grid would come wildly short of what was needed to provide for the needs of the state of Texas. The rolling blackouts that in some parts of the states, I hear reports the rolling blackouts were 30 minutes on, 30 minutes off. In other parts of the state, for us, it was 2 straight days of no power at all. And so it seems to have varied geographically, region by region. I think there's going to have to be a serious inquiry into why it was. What were the factors that led the grid not to be able to meet the energy needs of Texans? I've seen some of the early debates back and forth. I've seen some of the reporting that a number of wind turbines froze in the low temperature environment. Texas is the #1 producer of wind energy in the country. About 25% of our electricity comes from wind, and so that was a factor. There were other electricity sources that also had significant weather-related problems, both natural gas and coal. And so I think we need to have a careful investigation, not in the passion of the moment, when people's emotions are high, but a careful, serious, fact-based examination about what factors led to the grid being vulnerable. The grid is something that is designed, it is maintained, it is operated, it is regulated at the state level. So that is not not a federal government operation, but ERCOT has produced real success in having low-cost energy here in the state of Texas. And most days out of the year, Texans are greater to have lower electricity bills than many other parts of the country. But at the same time, I think a lot of Texans are asking, well, why wasn't it there when we needed it? And we need to have a serious and careful examination of that based on the facts.
Should those officials be fired?
Well, it depends what decisions was made. There needs to be a serious examination of what factors led to the grid not being able to sustain the needs and failing massively. And that's something that I don't want to jump the gun and make assumptions about those decisions. You know, one of the things we're seeing online is, for example, this being a battlefront in the wars over alternative energy or fossil fuels and back and forth, and both sides blaming the other. Look, I think we should be driven by the facts, and I don't know. I've seen some of the early reporting. It seems there was a significant number of wind turbines that froze. My understanding is that there are wind turbines that are used in other environments that are colder that don't freeze, and so these turbines could have been treated in a way to prepare them for the cold weather. That being said, in most parts of Texas, there isn't cold weather very often, and so that's an examination that needs to be made, and an examination needs to be made of the other bases, the other sources of energy in the state, and where the lack of power generation came from, and what's the best way to respond to that and provide to that lack of power generation.
Senator Kerwin, what do you say to the people who saw you leave the state of Texas during this freeze?
Well, what I would say is I was taking care of my family the same way Texans all across the state were taking care of my family. And it certainly was not my intention for that to be understood as critics have tried to paint it as somehow diminishing the suffering and hardship other Texans had experienced. Look, Texans want this problem solved. I want this problem solved. I want the power on. We've got most of the homes that had lost power have gotten power back. That's a good first step. We still have water supply is still questionable in a lot of places, and that's frustrating. Having boil notices, that's frustrating too. The first thing we need to do is correct the immediate problem. And then the second thing we need to do is engage in the longer term examination. As I said, that the operation and regulation of that is at the state level and not the federal level, but I think those questions, Texans want answers, and I'm glad the governor is calling for the legislature to investigate that, because I think that is an investigation that needs to happen.
Last question.
Sure. Senator Cruz, a lot of people are calling your decision to go to Cancun during this time tone deaf. Did you come back because you felt guilty, or did you come back because you got caught and there was a lot of backlash for you going?
So the question from the video on the cell phone was whether the decision to go was tone deaf. Look, it was obviously a mistake, and in hindsight, I wouldn't have done it. I was trying to be a dad, and all of us have made decisions. When you've got two girls who've been cold for two days and haven't had heater power, and they're saying, hey, look, we don't have school, why don't we go, let's get out of here. I think there are a lot of parents that'd be like, all right, if I can do this, great. That's what I wanted to do. As I said, really from the moment I sat on the plane, I began really second guessing that decision and saying, look, I know why we're doing this, but I've also got responsibilities. And it had been my intention to be able to work remotely, to be on the phone, to be on internet, to be on Zoom, to be engaged, but I needed to be here, and that's why I came back. And then as it became a bigger and bigger firestorm, it became all the more compelling that I needed to come back, because our priority should be fixing this problem and making sure it doesn't happen again. And I didn't want all the screaming and yelling about this trip to distract even one moment from the real issues that I think Texans care about, which is keeping all of our families safe.
Okay, thank you all.
Suscríbete al canal Tu Mundo Ahora y activa la campanita, así no te perderás ninguna noticia de los hechos más importantes de América y el mundo.